Good afternoon. It's Teresa. Last week we left off with the Sanhedrin High Council doing their third trial of Jesus, and so very angry with him for correcting them, for saying that they were not doing things right. They wanted to kill him. But the Jewish people had lost the ability to execute corporal punishment, to put someone to death, when the Romans came in and took them over. The Romans were the only one that could actually kill someone. And so this Jewish council took Jesus to Pilate. He was the prefect for Judea at that time, for Jerusalem. He was the Roman governor that they had to go before. So the entire council took Jesus to Pilate, the Roman governor, and they began to state their case. This man has been leading our people astray by telling them not to pay their taxes to the Roman government and by claiming he is the Messiah, a king. Now, here in the 23rd chapter of Luke, we find out that this high council believes that if they take Jesus to the Roman governor and say that he's saying that he was king, that the Romans would think that was treason and that they would put him to death for that. But it didn't happen the way they thought it was going to happen. Pilate asked him, "Are you king of the Jews?" And Jesus replied, "You have said it." So Jesus didn't say, "Yes, I am." He just said, you have said, "I'm king of the Jews." Pilate turned to the leading priest and to the crowd and said, "I don't find anything wrong with this man." Pilate wasn't interested in whether or not this man was saying he was king of the Jews. He didn't care anything about the Jewish religion and what their laws were and what they said was right or wrong. He was just there to keep the peace in Jerusalem and execute Roman law. This didn't have anything to do with Roman law. As far as Pilate was concerned, he had not done anything. And Pilate kept that attitude the whole time. We will see this. But the high council became very insistent and said, "He's causing riots by his teaching wherever he goes, all over Judea, from Galilee to Jerusalem." And remember, Pilate was supposed to keep the peace and make sure there weren't any riots. So the council was reaching for anything that they thought would make Pilate mad enough to put Jesus to death. But here again, Pilate says, "Oh, he's a Galilean." Now, this is the fourth trial. Remember last week I told you that Jesus would go through 6 trials before they put him to death. This was the fourth trial. So Pilate said, when they said that he was, when they said that he was a Galilean, Pilate sent him to Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas was the one who had put John the Baptist to death because he had made public display that what Herod was doing by marrying his sister-in-law was not right in God's eyes. And the sister-in-law, Herodias, manipulated John the Baptist's death. Herod didn't want to put John the Baptist to death. He actually enjoyed going and talking to him and learning things about God. But Herodias was very, very angry that he had publicly insulted her and was doing everything she could to have him put to death until she trapped Herod. And Herod had to behead John the Baptist. And Herod's father, Herod the Great, was the one that had had all the little boys under the age of 2 killed when Jesus was born, because he didn't want to think of anyone but himself being king. And he knew that it had been prophesied that a king had been born in Bethlehem. Remember when the 3 wise men came through? So this is Herod the Great's son, Herod Antipas. He also was in Jerusalem because of the Passover to help make sure that riots didn't break out. So Pilate had sent Jesus to Herod Antipas because Galilee was under Herod's jurisdiction. Galilee was way up north of Jerusalem, but that was the area that Herod had rulership over. Pilate did not want to try Jesus. His wife was a follower of Jesus, and she, we learn in other Gospels, had actually come to him and said, don't have anything to do with putting this man to death. I've had dreams. He's an innocent man, and you should not have anything to do with his execution. And Pilate really tried. Pilate was not really in very good favor with the Jewish people. When he came in like a storm, and he wanted to put Roman emblems everywhere, even inside the temple. And the Jewish people really were angry with him and went to Rome and complained that he wasn't respecting their laws. In retaliation, he had gone in and taken money out of the treasury, demanded that it be given to Rome. So the Jewish people did not like Pilate. He didn't want any more trouble with the Jewish people. But he also knew that Jesus was an innocent man. He saw through the facade that the Sanhedrin and the Pharisees and the religious leaders were bringing these charges. He saw through it as just being jealousy. He didn't want any part of Jesus' execution, but he was in a position, in between a rock and a hard place. He needed to please the Jewish people, but he also had to uphold Roman law. So sending Jesus over to Herod was getting Jesus off his hands. Herod was delighted at the opportunity to see Jesus because he had heard about him and he just wanted to see a miracle. He asked Jesus question after question, but Jesus would not say anything. He would not answer him at all, and Herod got really angry at this. The leading priests and the teachers followed Jesus over to where Herod was, and they stood there shouting their accusations out. Herod and his soldiers soon began mocking and ridiculing Jesus, and finally they put a very expensive royal robe on him and was hailing him as King of the Jews. I'm sure that didn't make the Pharisees and the Sadducees very happy. But they sent him back to Pilate because Herod was angry that Jesus would not respond to him. Herod and Pilate had actually been enemies before this, but now they had to uphold Roman law, and they were trading Jesus off back and forth. Maybe that was part of their dislike for each other. I don't know. But Pilate called the leading priest and the other religious leaders back. So with Herod's trial, that was the 5th trial, and now this is starting the 6th trial. He brought the leading priest and other religious leaders along with the people, and he announced his verdict. You brought this man to me accusing him of leading a revolt, and I've examined him thoroughly on this point in your presence, and I find him to be innocent. Herod came to the same conclusion and sent him back to me. Nothing this man has done calls for the death penalty. So I'll just have him flogged and then I'll release him. Pilate thought that that would make the Jewish people happy. But a mighty roar came up from the crowd, and with one voice they were shouting, "Kill him and release unto us Barabbas." Barabbas was a man that was in prison for taking part in an insurrection against the Roman government, and he was also in jail for murder. Pilate argued with them because he wanted to release Jesus, but they kept shouting, "Crucify him, crucify him." The Jewish leaders did not want Jesus to get away. It was also right before Passover. And remember, there weren't supposed to be any executions during Passover. There weren't supposed to be any trials during Passover. And they were forcing the issue because they wanted this done so that they could do their Passover celebration. But for the 3rd time, Pilate demanded, "Why? What crime has he committed? I have found no reason to sentence him to death." So again, Pilate said, "I am just going to have him flogged, and then I will release him." But again, the mob shouted louder and louder, demanding that Jesus be crucified, and their voices prevailed. It is said that the priest and the religious leaders in the Sanhedrin were going through the crowd, trying to convince them to have Jesus be the one put to death. It was custom in those days that right before Passover, the Roman government would release one prisoner that they held captive. Barabbas was not the one that should have been released, but if he had have been released, the crucifixion would not have taken place, and Jesus would not have been able to make a doorway for us to go directly to the Father. So everything was going according to plan. There are so many passages in prophecy and Zechariah and in Isaiah and in the Psalms that tell exactly what's fixing to happen. As they requested, Pilate sentenced Jesus to die as they demanded. As they had requested, he released Barabbas, the man in prison for the insurrection and murder. But he turned Jesus over to their demands and their wishes. As they led Jesus away, he was carrying his cross. Jesus was very, very weak. The flogging that had taken place was with a cat of nine tails. It was strips of leather that had bits of metal on the end of them. And when they beat a person in this way, when they flogged a person in this way, the person was stripped of their clothing and they were laid over a stone. And so this flogging took place over their back and their buttocks and the backs of their legs. And their flesh would be ripped open and sometimes ripped all the way down to the bone. Other scriptures tell us that Jesus was beaten so badly. He had been beaten by the high council guards. He had been beaten at this flogging as well. And he was very, very weak. He had lost a lot of blood. I can't even imagine. The Passion of Christ gave the most graphic portrayal of this flogging of Jesus. He was bleeding all over. He was very weak. And yet it was Roman custom for the prisoner to carry the crossbeam of his cross he was going to be crucified on down a very long road. This was called the Via Dolorosa, which means the road of sorrows. Crucifixion was perfected by the Romans. All the way back in the 4th century, the Assyrians and the Babylonians and also the Persians had a form of crucifixion where they would hang someone from a tree after flogging them and allow them to bleed to death or just hang there until they died. When your arms are out on either side and the weight of your body is pulling down on those arms, it crushes your lungs flat. It's very hard to breathe. The Phoenicians actually were the ones in 3 BC that brought this method of crucifixion to the Roman people. And the Roman people ended up making a post that was put in the ground. And the person would first be nailed to that crossbeam, would be nailed to that post, and the person nailed to the crossbeam. But that person had to carry that cross all on this road up to this really high hill. It wasn't a mountain, it was a hill, and it was called Golgotha. Golgotha is Aramaic for skull. It is also called Calvary. That is the Latin word for skull. So there was a formation on the side of this hill, a rock formation that actually looked like a human skull. And that's why it was called Golgotha. And this is where they would take the prisoners that were going to be crucified. They didn't crucify Romans. It was too terrible a torture for Roman citizens. But they crucified foreigners and Christians and Jewish people that had committed crimes. So as they led Jesus away, halfway there was a time that Jesus fell. And the Roman guards got a man named Simon of Cyrene to come and carry Jesus's crossbeam the rest of the way. Another thing I did not tell you that would happen when this person would be on this Via Dolorosa road carrying his crossbeam was that many times the Romans would cut off some of their fingers so that they would bleed more and torture them more, or they might cut off an arm so that they only had one arm to carry that crossbeam with. Sometimes they would actually kill infant children of that person being crucified and hang them around the neck of the person as they were walking on this road. Sometimes they would put a sign around their neck telling what crime they had committed. And if that sign was not put around their neck, it was carried by a Roman guard ahead of them so that everyone could see what he had done wrong. There was no Roman guard carrying a sign in front of Jesus. There was no sign around his neck. Jesus had committed no crime, and Pilate knew that. When Pilate had said, "I will not do anything more with this man," he actually washed his hands in a bowl of water. Other Gospels tell us that. He wanted nothing to do with Jesus's crucifixion, yet he knew he had to appease the Jewish High Council and allow this crucifixion to take place. And he had to allow it to take place before their Passover. So as Jesus was coming in from the Jerusalem, going to the cross, going to be crucified on the cross, and Simon was carrying his cross, it was at this point that some women that were in the large crowd that were following them were weeping so heavily. And Jesus turned and said to them, "Daughters of Jerusalem," Luke is the only one that tells us that he does this. "Daughters of Jerusalem, don't weep for me, but weep for yourselves and your children. For the days are coming when they will say, 'Fortunate indeed are the women who are childless, the wombs that have not borne a child, and the breasts that have never nursed.'" He was talking about what was going to happen to Jerusalem in 35 years when Titus would make a siege against Jerusalem and people would starve inside and see their children starve. He says, "People will beg the mountains to fall on them and plead with the hills to bury them. For if these things are done when the tree is green," and he's talking about when he's there with them. He was comparing himself to a green tree. He was also comparing the Jewish leaders to a dry, dead tree. And he says, "For if these things," the crucifixion, these horrible things, "are done when the tree is green, what will happen when the tree is dry, when Jesus is not there, and just the Jewish Sanhedrin and Pharisees are there to guide the people?" Constantine, 4 centuries after Jesus' death, banished crucifixion and said it could not happen anymore. Constantine was a Roman governor 400 years after this crucifixion of Jesus. There were 2 other men that were following Jesus, carrying their cross beams as well. They were thieves. They were going to be crucified at the same time. When they came to the place called the Skull, they nailed Jesus to the cross. And the criminals also were nailed to the crosses, and they were put one on either side of Jesus. There is prophecy that tells us that this happened. And it was prophesied 100 years before this happened. God was trying to tell everyone what would happen when Jesus came. There were some people that had studied the scriptures, a man named Joseph and a man named Nicodemus. We're going to find out in a minute how they believed the scriptures. They were secret followers of Jesus. They did believe, but most of the people did not. But I want you to know that every single thing that's happening here was prophesied. Most of those things 100 years before this was actually happening. As he was being crucified, he says one of 6 things when he's on the cross. And this is the first thing he says. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they're doing. Jesus knew that if the Roman soldiers knew what they were doing, if the Pharisees and Sadducees really actually believed he was Messiah, they would not have been crucifying him. But if they had not crucified him, if Jesus had not been crucified on the cross, he would not have been able to save us. So he couldn't save himself and do what the Father wanted him to do. The soldiers gambled for his clothes by throwing dice. This is talked about also in prophecy. The crowd watched, and the leaders scoffed at Jesus and said, "He saved others. Let him save himself if he is really God's Messiah, the chosen one." And the soldiers mocked him by offering him a drink of sour wine. Now, this sour wine was a mixture of gall and sour wine that was given to those that were going to be crucified, actually as an act of mercy, to dull their senses when they were being put on the cross. Those two thieves must have drank this wine, this gall that was mixed with it, because they were scoffing Jesus as well. They all called out to him, "If you are King of the Jews, save yourself." And a sign was fastened to the cross above him with these words, "This is the King of the Jews." Pilate had this sign put there, and it was written in 3 different languages so that everyone could see. I believe that Pilate put this up there just to spite the Jewish leaders for what they were doing, because the thing they were angriest at was that Jesus was not denying that he was King of the Jews. One of the criminals hanging beside him scoffed and said, "So you're the Messiah, are you? Prove it by saving yourself and us too while you're at it." These men were nailed to these crosses at 9 o'clock, and this was now high noon. The effects of the gall must have been wearing off. One of these thieves realized he might be on that cross for 4 to 7 days, because sometimes that's how long it took a person to die when they were being crucified. There was a little ledge that was at the bottom where the feet had been nailed to the cross, and they could push against that ledge and push themselves up, which would take some of the pressure off of where the nails were pierced through their wrist, and also allow them to have a good breath of air. But they would tire. Remember, they had all been flogged. They were all tired. They were all exhausted. They didn't have much energy. They had all lost a lot of blood. And so they would sink back down. And when they would, their chest would cave in on them, and it would be hard to breathe. And so after 3 hours of being on the cross this way, this one thief realizes he doesn't want to go through 4 to 7 days of this. He also was very touched by what Jesus had said when he asked for his Father to forgive the people that were crucifying him. I'm sure he believed if Jesus and God the Father could forgive these soldiers for crucifying the Son of God, and he asked to be forgiven for his sins of stealing things, surely Jesus would forgive him. And so the other criminal says to the one that is scoffing at Jesus, "Don't you fear God even when you have been sentenced to die? We deserve to die for our crimes, but this man has done nothing wrong." And then he looked at Jesus and he said, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." This is the second statement coming up that Jesus makes on the cross. "I assure you, today you will be with me in paradise." So this shows us that even with our last breath, we can ask God to forgive us of our sins and accept Jesus as Lord and Savior and be grafted into the kingdom of God. Hopefully, if you haven't done that yet, you won't wait until your last breath. It might happen unaware. You might not realize, like this man realized, he was dying on the cross. The other thief never repented, and he did not go with Jesus to paradise that day. By this time, it was high noon, and a darkness fell over the whole land. In Egypt, one of the plagues was the darkness fell over the whole land, and this same thing was happening. Jesus, the light of the world, was at this point taking the sins of the world on him, and God the Father had to turn away. He had to remove the light, not only from Jesus, but from the whole world. There's other cultures that talk about this day when there was a period of 3 hours that darkness covered the whole earth. Josephus records it. Other historians record it. It actually did happen. This crucifixion of Jesus really happened on the cross. Darkness fell across the whole land until 3 o'clock. 3 o'clock was when the lambs would be slaughtered in Jerusalem, and they would be prepared for the Passover meal. Jesus was becoming the Passover lamb. He was fulfilling the feast of Passover with his own body. That lamb would be killed for forgiveness of the people's sin and remembrance of the deliverance that God had taken them through out of Egypt, out of their slavery, out of their bondage. Jesus was dying to take us out of our sins and our bondage to those sins that Satan had tempted us to go into. There's so much prophecy that was being fulfilled at this time. Suddenly, a curtain in the sanctuary was ripped in two. This curtain divided the holy place from the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant was, where the priest would go in and put blood down, asking for forgiveness once a year of the people's sins. That curtain divided this holy place from the Holy of Holies because only one high priest could go in once a year. Jesus was now becoming our high priest. And that curtain was as thick as my hand, not this way, but this way. It was layer after layer after layer of woven material. It was put there because if a person walked into that most holy place, that Holy of Holies, they would die because they had sin inside of them. The priest that would go in once a year would go through all kinds of sanctification processes to make sure he had covered all of his sins with the blood of animals before he went in there. Jesus's body was also a representation of this curtain. This curtain was actually torn in two from the top to the bottom. And there are historians like Josephus that records this in his writings. It supernaturally was torn apart by God because the people no longer had to fear being in the presence of God if they went through Jesus as that doorway to God. So this curtain being torn in two was a representation of Jesus's body being torn apart on the cross. At that time, there was a great earthquake, and the whole earth shook. That was another plague that had happened in Egypt. And the last plague was the firstborn dying, and Jesus was God's firstborn. There's so many things that have been repeated now in the Bible. Then Jesus was offered wine, sour wine. It was a vinegar by that time. A sour wine was called vinegar at that time. It was lifted up on a hyssop branch for Jesus, and it touched his lips. This was another prophecy. So Jesus was fulfilling all these things. He did his last sanctification with that thief on the cross. And now he has drank from this hyssop, this sour wine, and he says, "It is finished." Luke does not record this. It was the fifth thing that Jesus said on the cross. The fourth thing was he said, "I'm thirsty." And that's when the hyssop branch was lifted up. And now he says his sixth statement on the cross. He says, "Father, I entrust my spirit into your hands." And with these words, he breathed his last breath. When the Roman officer that was overseeing the execution saw what had happened, he worshiped God and said, "Surely this man was innocent." And when all the crowds, only Luke reports this, when all the crowds that came to see the crucifixion saw what had happened, they went home in deep sorrow, beating their breast. Jesus' friends, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance watching. Luke is the only one that records the things that happened with the women. He records there was a good and righteous man named Joseph. He was a member of the Jewish High Council. That means he was part of the Sanhedrin. But he had not agreed with the decision and the actions of the other religious leaders. He was from the town of Arimathea in Judea, and he was waiting for the kingdom of God to come. He was a secret follower of Jesus, and he had read the scriptures, and he knew that Jesus was supposed to be put in a new tomb that no one had ever been put in. And he had had a tomb carved out of the rock really close to this Golgotha hill. He went to Pilate. He risked everything going to Pilate. He knew if he went to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body, everyone would know. All of the Jewish leaders would know, and they would shun him at this point. But he loved Jesus more than he loved his religious position. He also knew that if he handled a dead body, he would not be able to share the Passover meal. So he loved Jesus more than he loved ritual. He had another man with him, Nicodemus. Nicodemus was a part of the Pharisees, and he too was a secret follower of Jesus. Luke does not record this part of Nicodemus, but we know from other Gospels that Nicodemus was there helping Joseph. It took two men to lower a body. Linen cloth was put around Jesus's chest and tethered to the cross. One of them held that tethered linen cloth, and the other one had to pull the nails out of his wrist and the nails out of his feet. This was done so that his body just didn't fall off the cross, and they lowered him down from that cross. Oh, there was a third thing that I did not remember to tell you that Jesus said when he was on the cross. He looked down at his brother John, who was standing beside his mother, and said, "John, behold your mother. Woman, behold your son." He cared about women. He cared about his mother. I'm so sorry that I forgot that part. I'm glad I didn't forget it before this video was over. But now, the body is being removed with a long sheet of linen cloth, and Nicodemus and Joseph wrapped it around Jesus. They also had some herbs that they put in the linen wrapping, and they laid him in this new tomb that had been carved into the rock. This was done late on Friday afternoon, the day of preparation, as the Sabbath was just about to begin. As his body was taken away, the women from Galilee followed and saw the tomb where his body was placed. Luke is really good to tell us about the women. Then they went home and prepared other spices and ointments to anoint his body with. You see, they didn't have time to do all of this because the Sabbath was starting, and you could not work on the Sabbath. So Joseph and Nicodemus who was a secret follower, both of them of Jesus, they would not be able to take part of the Passover meal. All these women were staying back. They were the ones that prepared the food, and they knew they had to go and finish the preparations for the Passover, but they were also preparing spices and oils. They were going to go back when Passover was over the next morning, and they were going to properly prepare Jesus's body. They had to see where he was buried in order to do this. These women were there at all these crucial times in Jesus's crucifixion and burial. They rested as required by law and got ready to come the next morning. I want to read something in Psalms 22. David wrote Psalms 22 hundreds of years before Jesus' crucifixion. He knew nothing of crucifixion, but God laid on his heart this psalm. And I'm going to paraphrase it because as David is crying out to the Lord, you will remember some of the things, some of the statements that were made on the cross when Jesus was crucified. My God, why have you abandoned me? That was the first thing Jesus said on the cross. Then, everyone who sees me mocks me, and they sneer and shake their heads, saying, is this the one who relies on the Lord? Then let the Lord save him. You remember when everyone was mocking Jesus? After he had said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. He says, my life is poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. When you're hanging on a cross, all your bones fall out of joint. My heart is like wax melting within me. My strength has dried up like sun-baked clay, and my tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. These men were there in the sun. I'm sure dehydration was taking place. Remember when Jesus said, I'm thirsty? When you get thirsty, your mouth gets really dry and your tongue cleaves to the top of the roof of your mouth. My enemies surround me like a pack of dogs, and the evil gang closes in on me. They have pierced my hands and feet. David wasn't saying that this happened to him. He didn't have his hands and feet pierced. I can count all my bones. You could see Jesus's bones through the places where he had been flogged. My enemies stare at me and gloat. They divide my garments among themselves and throw dice for my clothing. In Psalm 69, it also talks about Jesus's clothing being gambled for. We had been told that this was going to happen. The people at that time had been told this was going to happen. It was all prophesied, and now it was happening. This should help us be quickened in our spirits to know that all the other things that Jesus said that's going to happen. Just like he said to the women, don't weep for me, weep for yourself because of what's going to happen to you later on. Next week, we're going to study the last chapter of Luke, chapter 24. It talks about the resurrection of Jesus, a much happier thing that happens. I see these things happening in my mind, and I encourage you to read Luke chapter 23 and see these things happening in your mind. They're real. There's a lot of theologians that have tried to say, oh, Jesus just swooned and fainted. He really didn't die. And when he was put in the tomb, he was revived because it was cool and dark. No, he wasn't revived. He was dead. Roman soldiers knew when someone was dead. They declared him dead. We find out in the next chapter that even the Pharisees and Sanhedrin declared him dead. We're going to pick this back up next week. Until then, I love you. I hope you have taken this teaching seriously and you let God show you how to apply it to your life. See you next week in the gardens.